Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Luna New Moon by Ian McDonald. Talk very briefly about the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the book, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I will be reading for next time. Ian McDonald's a pretty well-known science fiction author. He's written several different books, several different book series. He's been writing for roughly 40 years. He has been nominated or won almost every British science fiction award there is. I believe he was also nominated for several Hugos. I don't think he's ever won the grand prize for the novel length work. Dervish House has been on my bookshelf for a very long time, and I just have not gotten around to reading it. I think that, along with Brazil, are kind of his two most well-known works, other than this book, which is part of a series. This is a 3-book trilogy that finished up a couple years ago. This book, I think, originally came out in 2015. So Ian McDonald's a relatively well-known author, and this book in this series is typically referred to as Game of Thrones in space. And so that is essentially, there's another book that's kind of a clear innocent to this as well. We'll get into it in a little bit, but if you just took that premise, why is it like Game of Thrones in space? There's basically, in the near future, about 50 or 60 years into the future, there are 5 families on the moon who are referred to as the 5 dragons in this novel, and they are vying for power, political, economic power, and they do all kinds of backstabbing and contracts and things like that in order to try to gain one up on the other families. They all control different industries, and the main family we follow are the Cortes, who are a family who are originally from Brazil, and they control what is called helium-3, which is used to power Earth. It's not a hard science fiction novel, so you don't get into like the ins and outs of what all this stuff actually does, but just essentially know that that's what they do. And the book has several different characters, several different viewpoint characters that we follow. I think the book is a mixture of second and third person. At times goes into second person, but it's has a pretty large cast of characters. Most of them are Cortes. There's a little bit of Mackenzies, who are kind of the rival family, the main rival family of the Cortes, and it's basically what's on the tin. And Ian McDonald has kind of created this world and thrown all these kind of cool bits into it. And I think that's one of the better things about the novel, is that this world feels like a hodgepodge or a mixture of these different cultures, and they have different secret societies, and they handle things very differently and strangely on the moon. It's a very, from the minute you get to the moon, you essentially have a countdown clock that's counting down your oxygen, your water, your carbon, and essentially, if you die and you are in debt, the reclaimers will claim your body to make sure that there was nothing that went to waste. And so it's very much a libertarian paradise in that sense of just everything has a price to it. And it's a very dog-eat-dog world, and these 5 families have kind of set it up this way, and the book is really a fight, fight for power between these 5 families. Again, this is the first book of the trilogy, but that's essentially what the book is. And so if you like that, then you will probably like this book. If you like Game of Thrones, a lot of the similarities, you'll probably like this book. I think he does a good job of having all these different cool bits to play with in the book. I think he has a good job for the dramatic and kind of finding different ways for these characters to have. It's almost like a telenovela. The drama is always very, very high with all these characters. You have Adriana Corta, who's kind of the aging matriarch, and she's going to hand over the reins of power to one of her 5 children, I believe. There's 5 of them, and it's a question of who is she going to hand the power over to. They all have, children and lovers and paramours and wives and husbands, and so it's just kind of a hodgepodge of different relationships that you're keeping track of. And you have a character whose name is, I believe, Marina, who is kind of coming fresh to the moon, and her story of why she's coming to the moon and how she kind of integrates herself into this world, and the fight for survival and the fight for wealth and the fight for power. He does set pieces really, really well. There's 3 or 4 set pieces. A lot of critics have pointed out the end of the book as like kind of a one long set piece that's done really, really well. I agree with that. Is true. There's certain things to the world where there's no guns on the planet, and so everybody fights with bladed weapons. There are familiars, which are kind of these like AI personal assistants, which is kind of a cool touch. There are, in courts, the legal system is set up to where you can basically duel to the death, and attorneys are closer, almost like fighters, warriors, as they are like legal professionals. And so there's a lot of cool, weird bits to the book, and at times it does feel overstuffed with the weird bits. One of it in particular, I'm not going to talk about due to spoilers, but it's just kind of a weird thing in this book and kind of thrown in there. And I'm sure that it's going to have complications as we go down the line, but it is one of those things in reading it does feel like it was out of place. I don't know how much of a spoiler it is, so I'm just going to, for the sake of it, if you've read the book, you've probably heard about it, but it just kind of feels out of place for this particular novel. Again, going forward, it may fit right into what he was trying to do, but for what it was in this, it didn't really work. And that overall, if I was going to say the problems of the book, I appreciate this book more than I liked it. I like the ambition of it. I like the idea of just trying to do this. To me, what it felt like was we're going to take Dune. And I read John Scalzi's The Collapsing Empire. I'll leave a link below there as someone who I think was like, let us update Dune and see what happens. This to me was like an updated version of Dune. And if you are someone who likes the concept of these fighting families fighting for resources, backstabs and betrayals and all this infighting and dynastic wealth and scarce resources, you're going to love this book because it's essentially, in my opinion, if you made Dune into a ensemble book instead of basically Paul's story, it would be very similar to this in terms of everything that I just said. I think where wish this book did a better job, it did feel very much like one version of the story, which is the Cordes version. You don't really spend as much time with the other families, at least in this book, that I would have liked. There are 3 or 4 other families. There are secret societies. They all have kind of wheels within wheels of plots and machinations and all that stuff. And while I thought that was interesting, there are times where I was like baffled why there's so much stuff coming at me. And I think Ian McDonald's theory is just to kind of keep throwing things at you and just to kind of keep the plot moving along. And I think it does that, but it also, I think there's times where I was like left, I wish I had more time to breathe a little bit. There are times where the pacing does slow down and there's some info dumps in the book. I remember there's one info dump that happened, and then we came back to a major plot point. I'm like, had I forgotten this thing had happened? And I sure enough had forgotten this thing had happened. That was this major plot point in the book. So the info dumping, I think, could have been handled maybe a little bit better. I think he does a good job of being somewhat judicious about it. The main issue I had with it is I didn't really connect with any of the characters. There are some characters who are maybe more sympathetic than others. I had a hard time liking any of them, to be honest with you. And a lot of it felt like super sexy evil people doing super sexy evil people things. And I had a hard time rooting for any of the characters in the book, even though I know that he is kind of wanting me to root for certain characters. But this world is so kind of harsh and unforgiving, and the people who have power have so much power in the world that it was hard for me to actually feel like, okay, well, this person, there's one character in the book who is 17, and he is Lucasino, who I may have mentioned at the beginning, has this cool set piece where he is on the surface of the moon and does this moon run, and that was super cool to introduce you to the world. But he's like 17 and he's not really a super interesting character, and we spend some time with him kind of learning that he likes to bake, and he's bisexual and does a bunch of does drugs and all this, and it's just like in this book with so many characters and so much going on, I wish there had been maybe a little bit more of an edit to really get us down to a lower number of characters and maybe get a little bit more diversity of the world in terms of these different viewpoints of these different characters. To me, when I think of Game of Thrones, one of the things I think of is the moral ambiguity of the different houses. And they all think, I don't know if this is a Shakespearean quote or it's apocryphal to Shakespeare, but every person thinks of the hero in their own story. And I think there's a little bit of that missing in this book. So there is that. And it is a very, very dark book. And there is several, to me, in my opinion, gratuitous sex scenes. One in particular was on the edge of being erotica, and so it is a very, very adult book. And so if that's not something you know about or comfortable with going into the book, that may be a hard thing for you to overcome. It may just not be to your cup of tea. But there's a couple places that, there's one place in particular where there's about to be a child bride or child husband that I didn't care for, that I think he could have probably cut that. It was kind of unnecessary. If you read Dune, there are similar things in Dune. And there are similar plot points in this book than to Dune. And so there's a lot of Dune influence in this book. And so if you're like, I want an updated version of Dune, that's based on like the real world or closer to this timeline. I don't want guns, but I do. I'm going to tolerate supercomputers. That I think you're going to really like this because it to me is kind of a similar thing. Except I didn't care. I had a hard time connecting with the characters. I wish I had fewer characters and more reason to like them. But it felt like the drama was. This is a stupid way to say this, but it did feel in some way that the drama was manufactured and very much like a surface or telenovela drama, and less of having to do with this person's wants and this person's needs. There's one or two characters too who felt kind of Mary Gary Sue-ish, and I didn't care for that. But he does. Ian McDonald is a good writer. Like he does things like he mirrors certain things in the book that you can kind of tell. Okay, well he kind of mirrors this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing, and there's thought and technique that he applies. There's one or two times where I because there's so many characters, this character pops up and you're like, I don't know who this character is. There is a glossary and there's a character list in the book, so you can go back and see, well, who is this character and what is the relationship to this other character. But I don't know if you would have needed that if we had spent more time with maybe the other family. So this book is someone's favorite book for sure. It scratches a very particular itch. I appreciate the book more than I like it, though I acknowledge that there was some skill and thought put into it. And I think the book is very entertaining. In my opinion, it's very dark and really not my cup of tea necessarily. But I'm sure that there are other people who are very, very much like this. And if you're someone who is looking for kind of a dark sci-fi trilogy, again, this is just the first book. But if this sounds interesting to you, I would definitely recommend checking it out because it is a quick read. He does pace things relatively well, and he has a way to propel you through the book. And there's a lot of that. And Cory Doctorow, I read on the Wikipedia, had a glowing review, and I'm not shocked having read The Walkaways. There's a lot of similarities in some of the things that Cory clearly likes that are in this book. So I thought that was a point of praise to pass along. So if you are looking for like, a Dune-like book where families are fighting each other for scarce resources, and you want it a little bit sexier, then you will probably like this book. So that is Luna, New Moon by Ian McDonald. Next time I'm going to be reading a nonfiction book, How Migration Really Works. And if you haven't had a chance, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you've enjoyed this, please hit the like button for me. And I'll leave the link below to John Scalzi's Collapsing Empire. And until next time,